In the shadow-laden corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio, where whispers carried more weight than gold and a single misstep could mean exile or death, Niccolò Machiavelli learned the most fundamental truth about power: those who refuse to confront their weaknesses will inevitably be destroyed by them. It was the autumn of 1512, and Florence trembled as foreign armies carved through Italian soil like hot knives through butter. The Medici family had returned from exile with Spanish steel at their backs, ready to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Machiavelli, then Secretary of the Second Chancery, watched from his modest office as the political order he had served crumbled around him. The man who would later pen The Prince was experiencing firsthand the brutal lesson that would define his most famous work: in the arena of power, there is no mercy for the unprepared, no forgiveness for the weak, and no second chances for those who fail to eliminate their fatal flaws before their enemies exploit them. The morning air in Florence carried the scent of fear that October. Merchants shuttered their shops early, nobles whispered in hushed tones behind closed doors, and the common people went about their daily business with the careful deliberation of those who knew that the wrong word or gesture could bring catastrophe. Machiavelli had seen this pattern before in his diplomatic missions across Italy. He had watched powerful men fall not because they lacked resources or intelligence, but because they possessed a single, glaring weakness that their enemies eventually discovered and exploited with surgical precision. Consider the case of Cesare Borgia, whom Machiavelli would later immortalize as both hero and cautionary tale in his political treatise. Borgia possessed nearly every quality necessary for absolute power: ruthlessness when required, charm when beneficial, strategic brilliance that could outmaneuver seasoned generals, and the backing of his father, Pope Alexander VI. Yet Borgia harbored one critical flaw that would ultimately prove his undoing: an excessive reliance on his father's continued survival and political protection. When Alexander VI died suddenly, in 1503, Borgia found himself stripped of his primary source of power and protection. His enemies, who had been waiting patiently in the shadows like wolves circling wounded prey, immediately moved to destroy him. All of Borgia's previous victories, all of his carefully constructed alliances, all of his accumulated wealth and territory meant nothing in the face of this single vulnerability. Within months, the man who had terrorized his enemies and commanded respect across Italy was fleeing for his life, ultimately meeting his end on a Spanish battlefield far from the halls of power where he once reigned supreme. This pattern repeated itself with monotonous regularity throughout the Italian peninsula during Machiavelli's lifetime. Powerful families, city-states, and individual leaders who seemed invincible would suddenly collapse, not due to overwhelming external force, but because a single weakness provided the key that their enemies needed to unlock their destruction. The Pazzi conspiracy against the Medici in 1478 succeeded in killing Giuliano de' Medici precisely because the conspirators identified and exploited Lorenzo's predictable presence at church services. The fall of Girolamo Savonarola in 1498 occurred not because his religious message lost popular appeal, but because his inflexibility and inability to compromise provided his enemies with the leverage they needed to turn public opinion against him. Machiavelli understood that power operates according to laws as immutable as those governing physics or mathematics. Just as a chain fails at its weakest link regardless of how strong the other links might be, a leader or state will be destroyed by their most significant weakness regardless of how many strengths they possess. This insight formed the foundation of what would become his most ruthless and controversial principle: the absolute necessity of identifying and eliminating one's flaws before others can exploit them for their own advantage. The process begins with unflinching self-examination, a practice that runs counter to human nature and the natural tendency towards self-deception. Most people, particularly those in positions of power, surround themselves with advisors and courtiers who tell them what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. They construct elaborate justifications for their failures and blind spots, attributing setbacks to bad luck, unfair circumstances, or the malice of their enemies rather than examining their own contributions to these disasters. Machiavelli observed this phenomenon repeatedly during his years as a diplomat and administrator. He watched powerful men rationalize away their defeats, explaining military losses as the result of weather or terrain rather than poor planning or inadequate preparation. He saw political leaders blame their advisors for bad counsel while refusing to acknowledge their own poor judgment in selecting those advisors. He witnessed rulers attribute popular unrest to foreign agitation rather than examining whether their own policies had created the conditions for rebellion. True power requires the courage to see oneself clearly, without the comforting distortions of ego or wishful thinking. It demands the intellectual honesty to acknowledge that every strength potentially conceals a corresponding weakness, that every advantage carries within it the seeds of future disadvantage. The leader who prides himself on being decisive may discover that his quick judgment prevents him from gathering sufficient information before making critical choices. The ruler who values loyalty above all else may find that his reluctance to remove incompetent supporters creates vulnerabilities that more pragmatic enemies can exploit. The identification process must extend beyond personal characteristics to encompass every aspect of one's position and circumstances. Financial weaknesses, military vulnerabilities, diplomatic isolation, economic dependencies, family obligations, personal relationships, health concerns, and psychological blind spots all represent potential avenues for attack. Each element must be examined not merely for its current state, but for how it might be exploited under various scenarios and changing circumstances. Consider the meticulous analysis that Machiavelli recommended for assessing military vulnerabilities. A prince must not only evaluate the current strength and readiness of his forces, but must also consider how those forces would perform under different conditions, during siege warfare versus open battle, in familiar territory versus foreign campaigns, with adequate supplies versus during shortages, with experienced commanders versus with new leadership. He must examine whether his military depends too heavily on particular types of troops, specific geographic advantages, or individual commanders whose loss could prove catastrophic. The same thorough analysis applies to economic foundations. A state that depends heavily on trade must consider what would happen if key trade routes were blocked or if important commercial partners became hostile. A ruler whose treasury relies primarily on taxes from a particular region or industry must plan for scenarios where that source of revenue might be disrupted or eliminated. Those who have built their wealth through alliances with powerful foreign allies must consider how shifts in international politics might leave them isolated and vulnerable. Political relationships require equally careful scrutiny. Alliances that seem strong during prosperous times may prove fragile when tested by adversity or when the interests of the allied parties begin to diverge. Supporters who appear loyal when their patron is powerful may quickly abandon him when his position becomes precarious. Even family relationships, traditionally considered the most reliable form of political support, must be evaluated for potential weaknesses, as history provides countless examples of siblings, children, and spouses who betrayed their relatives when opportunity and advantage aligned. Once weaknesses have been identified through this process of ruthless self-examination, the next phase involves developing strategies for their elimination or mitigation. This is where Machiavelli's approach diverges sharply from conventional wisdom and moral philosophy. While traditional ethical systems might counsel patience, gradual improvement, or acceptance of human limitations, Machiavelli's power-focused perspective demands immediate and decisive action, regardless of the moral implications or the potential harm to others. The elimination of weaknesses often requires what Machiavelli termed necessary cruelty, actions that might appear harsh or unjust to outside observers but which serve the essential function of preserving power and preventing greater disasters. A ruler who discovers that one of his closest advisors has become a liability due to incompetence, disloyalty, or simple bad judgment must be prepared to remove that advisor swiftly and completely, even if doing so causes personal pain or appears ungrateful for past services. This principle extends to all forms of weakness, whether they involve personnel, policies, or structural vulnerabilities. Military units that have proven unreliable must be disbanded or restructured, even if they contain soldiers who have served loyally for years. Economic policies that create dependencies or vulnerabilities must be changed, even if they have previously generated substantial benefits. Alliances that have become burdensome or dangerous must be dissolved, even if they were formed under circumstances of mutual benefit and trust. The speed and thoroughness of this elimination process often determines whether it succeeds or fails. Machiavelli observed that leaders who attempt to address weaknesses gradually or partially almost invariably fail, either because their enemies recognize what is happening and move to exploit the weakness before it can be eliminated, or because the incomplete nature of the solution creates new vulnerabilities that prove even more dangerous than the original problem. The case of Francesco Sforza, Duke of Milan, provides an excellent illustration of successful weakness elimination. When Sforza initially gained power, he faced the problem of ruling a population that viewed him as a foreign usurper rather than a legitimate sovereign. This represented a potentially fatal weakness, as popular discontent could provide foreign enemies or domestic rivals with the support they needed to overthrow him. Rather than attempting to win popular approval gradually through benevolent policies or public works projects, Sforza chose a more direct approach. He systematically identified and eliminated potential leaders of resistance, used strategic displays of force to demonstrate the futility of opposition, and simultaneously implemented policies that created new centers of power loyal to his regime. The process was brutal and involved significant suffering for those who opposed him, but it succeeded in transforming his greatest weakness into a source of strength. Within a few years, the same population that had initially viewed Sforza as an illegitimate ruler had come to depend on his continued rule for their prosperity and security. By eliminating the weakness of popular hostility swiftly and completely, rather than allowing it to fester and potentially metastasize, Sforza secured his position and established a dynasty that would control Milan for generations. The psychological dimension of weakness elimination proves equally important as the practical aspects. Most people, even those in positions of significant power, struggle with the emotional and moral implications of the ruthless self-examination and decisive action that effective weakness elimination requires. They hesitate to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about themselves or their situations, delay taking necessary but unpleasant actions, or implement half measures that fail to address the core problems while creating new complications. Machiavelli understood that these psychological barriers often prove more formidable than external obstacles. A leader might possess all the resources and authority necessary to eliminate a critical weakness but fail to do so because he lacks the emotional fortitude to make hard decisions or the intellectual clarity to see past conventional moral constraints to the practical necessities of his situation. The cultivation of what Machiavelli called virtue becomes essential for overcoming these psychological barriers. This concept, often mistranslated as virtue in the conventional moral sense, actually refers to the specific qualities that enable effective action in the political sphere: the ability to see situations clearly without emotional distortion, the courage to take decisive action even when the consequences might be personally painful, and the wisdom to recognize when conventional morality must be subordinated to practical necessity. This psychological transformation requires practice and deliberate cultivation. Like a soldier who must train extensively before he can perform effectively in the chaos and terror of battle, a political leader must develop his capacity for ruthless decision-making through gradually increasing challenges and responsibilities. Small acts of necessary ruthlessness prepare the mind and spirit for the larger sacrifices that maintaining power inevitably demands. The development of emotional detachment proves particularly crucial for effective weakness elimination. Leaders who remain too emotionally invested in their existing relationships, policies, or methods will find it impossible to eliminate these elements when they become sources of vulnerability. The ability to view oneself, one's associates, and one's circumstances as pieces on a strategic board rather than as extensions of personal identity allows for the kind of clear-eyed analysis and decisive action that effective governance requires. This detachment must not be confused with indifference or cruelty for its own sake. Machiavelli consistently emphasized that the goal of political action should be the preservation and enhancement of power for constructive purposes, not the infliction of unnecessary suffering or the pursuit of personal gratification. The ruthlessness he advocated serves instrumental rather than intrinsic purposes, employed as a tool for achieving stability, security, and effective governance rather than as an expression of personal malice or sadistic pleasure. The timing of weakness elimination operations requires careful consideration of both internal readiness and external circumstances. Acting too quickly, before one has developed the necessary resources and support, can result in failure and leave one in a worse position than before. Waiting too long, however, allows enemies to recognize and exploit vulnerabilities before they can be addressed. Machiavelli studied numerous historical examples of leaders who failed due to poor timing in their attempts to address critical weaknesses. Some acted precipitously, launching major reforms or purges before they had secured sufficient support or eliminated potential sources of opposition. Others delayed action for so long that their enemies were able to anticipate and counter their moves, turning what should have been strategic advantages into devastating defeats. The optimal timing for weakness elimination often coincides with periods of apparent strength and stability rather than obvious crisis. Paradoxically, the best time to address vulnerabilities is frequently when they seem least urgent, before enemies have recognized them or begun developing plans to exploit them. This requires a level of strategic foresight and long-term planning that distinguishes truly effective leaders from those who merely react to immediate circumstances. Consider the example of Louis XI of France, whose reign Machiavelli studied extensively during his diplomatic career. Louis recognized early in his rule that the independent power of the great feudal nobles represented a fundamental threat to royal authority. Rather than waiting for these nobles to rebel or form coalitions against him, Louis began systematically undermining their power base while they still considered themselves loyal supporters of the crown. He used a combination of strategic marriages, economic incentives, legal manipulations, and carefully orchestrated conflicts to gradually reduce the nobles' independent military capacity, territorial control, and popular support. By the time the nobles recognized what was happening, they lacked the resources and coordination necessary to mount effective resistance. Louis had eliminated his greatest weakness during a period when most observers considered his relationship with the nobility to be stable and mutually beneficial. The implementation of weakness elimination strategies often requires what Machiavelli termed the lion and the fox approach, combining direct force with subtle manipulation depending on the specific circumstances and types of resistance encountered. Some vulnerabilities can be addressed through open, decisive action that demonstrates power and resolves the issue quickly and permanently. Others require more subtle approaches that gradually undermine the source of weakness while maintaining plausible deniability or avoiding the creation of new enemies. The choice between these approaches depends largely on the relative strength of one's position and the nature of the weakness being addressed. Leaders operating from positions of overwhelming strength can often afford to use direct methods that might prove catastrophic for those in more precarious circumstances. Conversely, those dealing with weaknesses that are deeply embedded in their power structure or that involve powerful allies or supporters may need to employ more subtle strategies that achieve the same ends without creating unnecessary conflicts or resistance. The key principle remains consistency of purpose rather than consistency of method. The goal of eliminating weaknesses must remain constant, while the specific tactics employed should be adapted to circumstances and opportunities as they develop. This requires a level of strategic flexibility that many leaders find difficult to maintain, particularly when faced with unexpected developments or resistance from sources they had not anticipated. The maintenance of multiple elimination strategies simultaneously often proves necessary for addressing complex weakness portfolios. Real political situations rarely involve single, isolated vulnerabilities that can be addressed through simple, straightforward actions. More commonly, leaders face interconnected webs of weakness where addressing one issue creates temporary vulnerabilities in other areas, or where the resources required for one elimination effort must be carefully balanced against the needs of other concurrent operations. This complexity requires sophisticated planning and resource allocation capabilities that go beyond the tactical requirements of individual weakness elimination efforts. Leaders must develop the capacity to think strategically across multiple dimensions and time horizons, balancing immediate necessities against long-term objectives while maintaining awareness of how actions in one area might create unexpected consequences elsewhere. The human cost of weakness elimination represents one of the most challenging aspects of implementing Machiavellian principles in practice. The process inevitably involves actions that cause suffering to individuals who may not deserve their fate according to conventional moral standards. Loyal supporters may need to be removed from positions of influence, innocent parties may be harmed by policies designed to eliminate structural vulnerabilities, and entire communities may suffer disruption as leaders reorganize their domains to eliminate sources of weakness. Machiavelli's approach to this moral dimension reflects his fundamental prioritization of political effectiveness over conventional ethical considerations. He argued that the failure to eliminate weaknesses when possible virtually guarantees greater suffering in the future, as enemies who exploit these vulnerabilities will typically cause far more damage than would result from their preemptive elimination. The leader who hesitates to remove incompetent generals due to personal loyalty may find himself responsible for military defeats that cost thousands of lives. The ruler who fails to address economic vulnerabilities to avoid disrupting established interests may ultimately preside over economic collapse that impoverishes entire populations. This utilitarian logic provides a framework for managing the moral complexity of weakness elimination, but it requires leaders to accept responsibility for difficult decisions and their consequences rather than seeking comfortable justifications or attempting to avoid moral culpability through inaction. The psychological burden of this responsibility often proves as challenging as the practical difficulties of implementation, particularly for leaders who entered politics with idealistic motivations or who maintain strong connections to conventional moral frameworks. The development of philosophical perspective becomes crucial for maintaining psychological equilibrium while implementing necessary but morally complex policies. Leaders must cultivate an understanding of their role that acknowledges both the unique responsibilities and the unique moral constraints that power imposes. This understanding must be robust enough to provide guidance during periods of intense pressure or criticism, when the temptation to abandon difficult but necessary policies becomes strongest. Machiavelli's own experience during the fall of the Florentine Republic illustrates both the importance and the difficulty of maintaining commitment to power principles under adverse circumstances. When the Medici returned to power and began restructuring the Florentine government, Machiavelli found himself accused of plotting against the new regime. Despite being subjected to torture and imprisonment, he maintained his belief in the principles he had developed through years of political observation and analysis. His correspondence during this period reveals a man who understood that his own situation demonstrated the very principles he had articulated. The Medici were acting according to sound political logic in eliminating potential sources of opposition to their rule, even though this meant destroying the career and prospects of a man who had served Florence faithfully for over a decade. Machiavelli's personal suffering, while genuinely painful, represented a necessary step in the Medici consolidation of power rather than an act of arbitrary cruelty or personal vindictiveness. This perspective allowed Machiavelli to maintain his intellectual integrity and continue developing his political theories even while experiencing their harsh consequences firsthand. Rather than abandoning his principles or becoming bitter about their application to his own situation, he used his exile as an opportunity to refine and articulate his ideas more systematically, ultimately producing the works that would establish his reputation as one of history's most influential political theorists. The long-term consequences of successful weakness elimination often prove as important as the immediate benefits, though they may be less obvious to casual observers. Leaders who effectively identify and eliminate their vulnerabilities create positive feedback loops that strengthen their position over time and increase their capacity to deal with future challenges. Each successful elimination operation enhances their reputation for effectiveness, provides practical experience in managing complex political problems, and demonstrates to potential enemies that attacks against them are likely to prove costly and unsuccessful. Conversely, leaders who fail to address known weaknesses or who implement elimination strategies poorly often find themselves caught in negative feedback loops where each failure makes subsequent challenges more difficult to address. Their enemies become bolder and more aggressive as they observe signs of weakness or indecision. Their supporters become less reliable as they begin to doubt their leader's competence or commitment. Their resources become stretched thinner as they are forced to deal with multiple crises simultaneously rather than addressing problems systematically before they reach crisis proportions. The compound effects of these feedback loops can transform relatively minor initial advantages or disadvantages into decisive factors that determine ultimate success or failure. Leaders who begin with modest resources but demonstrate consistent effectiveness in eliminating weaknesses may eventually surpass competitors who started with apparently superior positions but failed to manage their vulnerabilities effectively. The study of historical examples provides numerous illustrations of these long-term dynamics. The rise of the Roman Republic from a small city-state to the dominant power in the Mediterranean resulted partly from Rome's consistent application of principles similar to those later articulated by Machiavelli. Roman leaders demonstrated remarkable effectiveness in identifying and eliminating weaknesses in their political, military, and economic systems, often implementing harsh but necessary reforms that strengthened their position for future challenges. The Roman practice of incorporating conquered peoples into their system rather than simply exploiting them represents one example of strategic weakness elimination. Early Roman leaders recognized that ruling purely through force created ongoing vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit by encouraging rebellions or offering alternative sources of leadership to subject populations. By creating pathways for conquered peoples to become Roman citizens and participate in Roman institutions, they eliminated a major source of potential instability while simultaneously strengthening their military and economic base. Similarly, the Roman emphasis on practical military engineering and systematic training reflected their understanding that military weaknesses could not be compensated for through individual heroism or temporary advantages. They invested enormous resources in developing standardized equipment, consistent training procedures, and reliable supply systems that ensured their forces could perform effectively under a wide range of circumstances and against various types of enemies. The contrast between Roman success and the failures of other ancient powers often reflects differences in their approach to weakness elimination rather than differences in initial resources or circumstances. The Persian Empire, despite its vast territory and wealth, ultimately succumbed to Alexander's relatively small Macedonian force, partly because Persian leaders had failed to address fundamental weaknesses in their military system and political structure. The Greek city-states, despite their cultural achievements and military innovations, remained vulnerable to conquest because they never successfully eliminated the weakness of political disunity that prevented them from coordinating effective responses to external threats. These historical patterns suggest that the principles Machiavelli articulated reflect deeper truths about the nature of power and competition rather than merely describing the particular circumstances of early 16th century Italy. The same dynamics that determine success or failure among Italian princes continue to operate in contemporary political, business, and social contexts, though their specific manifestations may differ according to technological and cultural changes. Modern organizations face weakness elimination challenges that parallel those described by Machiavelli, though the specific vulnerabilities and available solutions reflect contemporary circumstances. Corporate leaders must identify and address weaknesses in their competitive position, organizational structure, financial foundation, and technological capabilities before competitors can exploit these vulnerabilities to gain market share or eliminate them entirely. Political figures in democratic systems must manage vulnerabilities related to public opinion, media coverage, fundraising capacity, and coalition building that could provide opportunities for electoral opponents. The acceleration of information flow and decision-making cycles in contemporary society has increased the importance of rapid weakness identification and elimination while simultaneously making these processes more difficult to execute effectively. Vulnerabilities that might once have remained hidden for years or decades can now be exposed and exploited within weeks or months. Leaders who fail to address known weaknesses quickly may find that their window of opportunity for corrective action closes before they can implement effective solutions. At the same time, the complexity of modern organizations and political systems has made weakness identification more challenging and elimination efforts more likely to create unintended consequences. The interconnected nature of contemporary institutions means that changes in one area often produce cascade effects that create new vulnerabilities elsewhere, requiring leaders to think systematically about the broader implications of their corrective actions. The enduring relevance of Machiavellian principles becomes evident when examining contemporary examples of successful and failed weakness elimination efforts. Organizations and leaders who have thrived despite initial disadvantages often demonstrate patterns of behavior that align closely with Machiavelli's recommendations, while those who have declined from positions of apparent strength frequently exhibit the kinds of weakness management failures that he identified as fatal to long-term success. The technology sector provides numerous illustrations of these dynamics in action. Companies that have successfully transitioned from startup status to market leadership typically demonstrate exceptional effectiveness in identifying and eliminating business model vulnerabilities, competitive disadvantages, and organizational weaknesses before they can be exploited by rivals. They ruthlessly eliminate products, strategies, and personnel that do not contribute to their core mission, even when these elements have historical significance or emotional importance to founders and employees. Conversely, established technology companies that have lost market position to newer competitors often exhibit classic patterns of weakness management failure. They maintain unprofitable product lines due to historical attachment rather than current strategic value. They retain organizational structures that reflect past circumstances rather than current competitive requirements. They hesitate to cannibalize existing revenue streams even when failure to do so guarantees eventual obsolescence. The financial sector provides equally compelling examples of the consequences of effective versus ineffective weakness elimination. Financial institutions that survived and thrived during periods of market instability typically demonstrated superior capability in identifying and addressing vulnerabilities in their risk management systems, capital structures, and business models before these weaknesses could be exploited by market conditions or competitors. The 2008 financial crisis illustrates both sides of this equation. Institutions that collapsed or required government assistance often had known weaknesses in their mortgage portfolios, capital ratios, or risk management systems that they had failed to address despite warnings from regulators and market analysts. Their leaders had chosen to maintain profitable but risky strategies rather than implementing the painful but necessary changes that would have eliminated these vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, institutions that emerged from the crisis stronger than before had typically spent years systematically identifying and eliminating weaknesses in their operations, even when doing so required short-term sacrifices in profitability or market share. They had built capital buffers that exceeded regulatory requirements, diversified their revenue streams to reduce dependence on particularly volatile sectors, and developed risk management capabilities that allowed them to recognize and respond to emerging threats before they became existential challenges. The political sphere provides additional confirmation of Machiavellian principles in contemporary contexts. Political figures who have achieved and maintained power in competitive democratic systems typically demonstrate exceptional skill in identifying and eliminating political vulnerabilities before opponents can exploit them effectively. They systematically address weaknesses in their public image, policy positions, financial support, and organizational capabilities that could provide opportunities for electoral challenges. Successful politicians often implement what appears to be counterintuitive strategy of acknowledging and addressing their weaknesses publicly rather than attempting to hide them from potential opponents. By confronting vulnerabilities directly and demonstrating their commitment to addressing them, they eliminate opportunities for opponents to use these issues as attack points while simultaneously reinforcing their reputation for honesty and effectiveness. The international relations sphere demonstrates the continued relevance of Machiavellian weakness elimination principles on a global scale. Nations that have successfully maintained or enhanced their position in the international system typically show consistent patterns of identifying and addressing strategic vulnerabilities before hostile powers can exploit them. They invest in military capabilities that address gaps in their defense posture, develop economic relationships that reduce dangerous dependencies, and build diplomatic alliances that provide alternatives to reliance on any single partner. The contrast between successful and unsuccessful approaches to national weakness elimination provides clear illustrations of Machiavellian principles in action. Countries that have declined from positions of international prominence often exhibit classic patterns of weakness management failure. They maintain military commitments that exceed their resources, depend too heavily on particular economic sectors or trading relationships, or fail to adapt their diplomatic strategies to changing international circumstances. The process of weakness elimination at the national level often requires the same kind of ruthless prioritization and decisive action that Machiavelli advocated for individual leaders. Nations must be willing to abandon ineffective policies, restructure unsuccessful institutions, and reallocate resources from comfortable but unproductive uses to challenging but necessary investments in future capabilities. The human dimension of weakness elimination remains as complex and morally challenging in contemporary contexts as it was during Machiavelli's time. Modern leaders face the same fundamental tension between the practical necessities of maintaining effective organizations and the human costs that necessary changes often impose on individuals and communities. The scale and complexity of modern institutions can magnify these costs while simultaneously making them less visible to leaders who must make ultimate decisions about organizational direction. The development of sophisticated human resource management practices and organizational psychology has provided leaders with tools for managing the human dimension of change that were not available to Machiavelli's contemporaries, but these tools do not eliminate the fundamental challenges involved in weakness elimination efforts. Even the most carefully planned and sensitively implemented changes will typically disadvantage some individuals or groups while benefiting others, creating moral dilemmas that require leaders to balance competing claims and conflicting values. The globalization of economic and political systems has added additional layers of complexity to weakness elimination efforts while simultaneously increasing their importance. Organizations and leaders now face competitive pressures and strategic challenges from a much broader range of sources than was typical in earlier historical periods, making effective weakness management more crucial for survival and success. At the same time, the interconnected nature of global systems means that weakness elimination efforts must account for their potential impact on stakeholders and competitors across multiple jurisdictions and cultural contexts. Actions that effectively address vulnerabilities in one context may create new weaknesses or generate hostile responses in others, requiring leaders to think systematically about the broader implications of their strategic choices. The acceleration of technological change has further complicated the weakness elimination process by reducing the predictable lifespan of competitive advantages and increasing the frequency with which organizations must reassess and restructure their core capabilities. Leaders must now manage weakness elimination as an ongoing process rather than an occasional necessity, continuously monitoring their strategic position and implementing corrections before vulnerabilities can be exploited by rapidly evolving competitive threats. Despite these contemporary complications, the fundamental logic of Machiavellian weakness elimination remains as compelling today as it was 5 centuries ago. The basic dynamic through which unaddressed vulnerabilities eventually become sources of catastrophic failure continues to operate across all domains of human competition and cooperation. The leaders and organizations that thrive in contemporary circumstances continue to be those that demonstrate superior capability in identifying and eliminating their weaknesses before others can exploit them for competitive advantage. The enduring power of Machiavelli's insight lies not in the specific tactical recommendations he offered for particular historical circumstances, but in his recognition of the inexorable logic through which weakness and strength interact in competitive environments. His fundamental contribution to strategic thinking was the understanding that defensive measures and reactive responses, while necessary, are insufficient for long-term success in any competitive arena. True strategic effectiveness requires the courage and capability to identify one's own vulnerabilities with brutal honesty, the wisdom to prioritize among multiple weakness elimination needs according to their potential impact and the resources available for addressing them, and the resolution to implement necessary changes despite their human costs and moral complexity. These requirements remain as challenging today as they were during the tumultuous period of Italian city-state politics that shaped Machiavelli's understanding of power dynamics. The leaders and organizations that master these capabilities develop what might be termed strategic immunity to many forms of competitive attack. By systematically eliminating their major vulnerabilities before opponents can exploit them, they force their competition to rely on direct confrontation rather than indirect manipulation of weaknesses. This dynamic typically favors those who have invested in comprehensive strength building rather than those who depend on identifying and exploiting the weaknesses of others. The cultivation of this strategic immunity requires sustained commitment to principles that often conflict with short-term comfort, popular opinion, or conventional wisdom. Leaders must be willing to make difficult decisions during periods of apparent stability rather than waiting for crisis conditions to force their hand. They must invest resources in addressing potential future problems rather than maximizing current returns. They must maintain readiness for challenges that may never materialize while simultaneously managing immediate operational requirements. The psychological and moral demands of this approach explain why effective weakness elimination remains rare despite its obvious strategic advantages. Most leaders, even those in highly competitive environments, struggle with the emotional discipline required for ruthless self-examination and the moral fortitude necessary for implementing necessary but painful changes. They find it easier to focus on their strengths and achievements rather than confronting their vulnerabilities and limitations. They prefer to hope that their weaknesses will not be discovered or exploited rather than accepting the costs involved in eliminating them. This natural human tendency toward weakness avoidance rather than weakness elimination creates ongoing opportunities for those willing to embrace Machiavellian principles despite their psychological and moral challenges. In any competitive environment, the majority of participants will focus primarily on developing their strengths and competing through their advantages rather than systematically eliminating their vulnerabilities. This creates a sustainable competitive advantage for those who master the more difficult discipline of weakness elimination. The ultimate measure of success in applying Machiavellian weakness elimination principles lies not in achieving perfect invulnerability, which is impossible in any dynamic competitive environment, but in developing superior capability for recognizing and addressing new vulnerabilities as they emerge. The goal is to create organizational and personal systems that can adapt quickly and effectively to changing circumstances rather than relying on static defensive measures that may become obsolete as conditions evolve. This adaptive capability requires institutionalizing the processes of weakness identification and elimination rather than treating them as occasional emergency measures. Leaders must develop systematic methods for monitoring their strategic position, regular procedures for assessing potential vulnerabilities, and established mechanisms for implementing corrective actions when problems are identified. These systems must be designed to function effectively during periods of success and stability when the temptation to relax vigilance is strongest. The historical record suggests that the leaders and organizations that achieve enduring success are those that manage to institutionalize these processes while maintaining the cultural commitment to implement their recommendations even when doing so requires significant sacrifice or change. They create organizational cultures that value strategic clarity over comfortable illusions, that reward honest assessment of problems over optimistic reporting, and that support necessary change efforts even when they disrupt established patterns or relationships. As we reflect on the lessons that Machiavelli drew from his observation of power dynamics in Renaissance Italy, we find that his core insight about the relationship between weakness and vulnerability remains as relevant today as it was when he first articulated it. The specific forms that weaknesses take may evolve with changing technology, social structures, and competitive environments, but the fundamental dynamic through which unaddressed vulnerabilities become sources of catastrophic failure continues to operate across all domains of human activity. The choice facing contemporary leaders mirrors the choice that confronted the princes and republics of Machiavelli's era. They can embrace the difficult discipline of systematic weakness elimination with all of its psychological and moral challenges, or they can hope that their strengths will prove sufficient to compensate for their vulnerabilities. History suggests that the second approach, while more psychologically comfortable and morally convenient, ultimately leads to defeat by those who have chosen the harder but more effective path of ruthless self-improvement. In the end, Machiavelli's rule about eliminating flaws before being consumed by them reflects a deeper truth about the nature of competition and survival in any complex system. Those who refuse to confront their own limitations will eventually encounter opponents who have no such reluctance. Those who fail to address their vulnerabilities systematically will ultimately face enemies who have made such systematic improvement their core strategic advantage. The only sustainable protection against this dynamic is to embrace it fully, accepting both its costs and its benefits as the price of long-term effectiveness in any competitive arena. The shadow-laden corridors of power that Machiavelli walked in Renaissance Florence continue to exist in contemporary form, though they may now be found in corporate boardrooms, government offices, and organizational headquarters rather than in the palaces of Italian princes. The fundamental dynamics remain unchanged. Success belongs to those who have the courage to see themselves clearly, the wisdom to act on what they see, and the resolution to pay the price that effective action requires. These timeless truths ensure that Machiavelli's insights will remain relevant as long as human beings compete for limited resources and struggle to maintain their positions in complex, evolving systems where weakness invariably invites attack and strength must be constantly renewed through conscious effort and strategic discipline.